They mocked his useless farm pond, until the drought hit every farm around him. The first time they laughed at Gideon Hayes, he was standing in the middle of a field with a shovel in his hands. There was nothing unusual about a farmer digging. What made everyone laugh was where he was digging. The land behind Gideon's farmhouse had always been considered useless. It was low, uneven ground surrounded by thick weeds and cracked earth. Nothing grew there properly. During heavy rain, it became muddy. During dry weather, it turned hard as stone. But Gideon stood there anyway. He had marked out a huge circle in the soil. His neighbor, Marlon Pierce, stopped his tractor at the edge of the property and stared. "What are you doing?" Gideon leaned on his shovel. "Building a pond." Marlon looked at the dry ground. Then he laughed. "A pond?" Gideon nodded. "You're wasting your money." Within minutes, 2 other farmers had joined them. They looked at Gideon's markings and shook their heads. One of them said, "That ground won't hold water." Another laughed. "You'd be better off planting another field." Gideon didn't argue. He simply returned to digging. Because there was something they didn't know. Gideon had spent months studying the land. He had noticed something everyone else had ignored. After every heavy rain, water naturally flowed toward that exact low point. It disappeared within hours because the soil was compacted and the surrounding drainage channels carried it away. Gideon believed that if he could capture that water instead of letting it escape, he could store enough to help his farm survive the dry season. So he began. Day after day, Gideon worked. He rented an old excavator when he could afford it. When he couldn't, he used his tractor. He shaped the banks carefully. He packed the soil. He planted grasses around the edges to help stabilize the ground. And he built a small overflow channel so excess rainwater could safely leave the pond. People kept laughing. "He's building a swimming pool for frogs. Maybe he'll start selling boat rides. That pond won't last until Christmas." Gideon heard every joke. But he never responded. He just kept working. By the end of autumn, the pond was finished. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't enormous. But it was deep enough to hold a substantial amount of water. Then winter came. Rain filled the pond slowly. Gideon watched the water level rise. For the first time, he smiled. He hadn't built the pond because he wanted something pretty behind his house. He had built it because he remembered something his father had taught him years earlier. A good farmer doesn't only prepare for the season he's in. He prepares for the season nobody expects. Gideon had no idea how important those words would become. Spring arrived. The fields turned green. The farms around Gideon's property looked magnificent. Marlon's wheat stretched across hundreds of acres. Other farmers planted corn, soybeans, vegetables, and hay. Everyone was optimistic. Gideon was too. But he kept watching the sky. By early summer, something changed. The rain stopped. At first, nobody worried. They had seen dry weeks before. Then another week passed. Then another. The soil began losing its moisture. Leaves started curling. Small streams became shallow. Farmers began checking weather forecasts every morning. Still, the rain didn't come. By July, the drought was serious. Marlon's wheat fields began turning brown. His irrigation costs exploded. Every farmer with a well began pumping more water. But the wells were dropping. The same people who had laughed at Gideon's pond were now standing beside their dry fields, wondering how long their crops could survive. One afternoon, Marlon drove to Gideon's farm. He found Gideon beside the pond. The water level had dropped, but there was still plenty left. Marlon climbed out of his truck. "Gideon." Gideon looked over. "How bad is it?" Marlon hesitated. "Bad." For the first time, Gideon noticed the exhaustion in his neighbor's face. Marlon looked at the pond. How much water do you have? Enough for my fields. Marlin nodded slowly. Then he asked the question he had never expected to ask. Could you help me? Gideon didn't hesitate. Yes. Marlin looked surprised. You aren't going to charge me? Gideon shook his head. Not for water. He helped Marlin connect a pump to the pond. The next morning, water began moving toward Marlin's most desperate field. But Gideon didn't stop there. When another farmer came, he helped them too. Then another. Soon, the pond became a lifeline. Gideon created a schedule so everyone could receive water without emptying the pond too quickly. Farmers who had once mocked him were now carefully measuring their water use. And something remarkable happened. Gideon's pond didn't just save his crops. It helped the entire neighborhood conserve what little water remained. Because everyone was now sharing a resource they had once believed was worthless. Weeks passed. The drought continued. Across the county, farms were suffering. Some fields were abandoned. Others produced only a fraction of their normal harvest. But Gideon's farm remained green. Not because he had somehow discovered a secret way to make rain. He simply had water stored from the months when everyone else had assumed they would always have enough. Then, one morning, the sky finally changed. Clouds gathered over the hills. Farmers came outside and stared upward. A single drop landed on Marlin's dusty windshield. Then another. And suddenly, rain began falling. People stood outside their homes laughing and crying. Children ran through the fields. Farmers watched the dry soil absorb the water. Gideon stood beside his pond. Rain struck its surface, creating thousands of tiny ripples. Marlin eventually walked over. He stood beside Gideon for a moment. Then he said quietly, I owe you an apology. Gideon smiled. For what? For laughing at you. Gideon looked across the pond. You weren't the only one. Marlin laughed. No. But I probably laughed the loudest. The two men stood silently as the rain continued. Then Marlin asked, How did you know? Gideon thought about his father's old advice. I didn't know. Marlin looked at him. I just prepared for the possibility. That sentence spread through the community. The following year, something changed. Farmers began building their own small water storage ponds. They restored drainage channels. They planted grasses along waterways. They started collecting rainwater instead of allowing every drop to run away. And Gideon helped them. He never charged for his knowledge. He simply showed them what he had learned. Years later, the old pond was still there. Trees had grown around it. Wildlife gathered along its edges. Birds came to drink. Children sometimes sat beside it and fished. But to Gideon, it represented something much bigger. It reminded him that the smartest decision isn't always the one that looks impressive today. Sometimes it's the decision everyone else laughs at. Sometimes it's the work nobody understands. And sometimes, the thing people call useless becomes the very thing they need most. Gideon never forgot the day everyone laughed at his pond. But he also never held it against them. Because the drought had taught the entire community a lesson. You don't wait for the crisis to start preparing for it. ***. You prepare while everything still looks fine. And when the difficult season finally arrives, the preparation you made in silence may become the reason everyone survives. If this story touched your heart, remember to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring farm stories where patience, courage, and simple ideas can change everything.